wagon began rolling backward before Clara Bennett had finished tying her bedroll to her shoulders. 2 crates slid toward the tailgate, a wheel jumped the curb, and a boy on the boardwalk froze directly in its path, while 3 grown men shouted uselessly. Clara dropped her bedroll and ran. She caught the boy by the coat and shoved him toward a doorway. Then she saw the wagon's rear brake shoe hanging loose. "Block the left wheel," she shouted. "Not the right, the left." A tall man in a weathered hat moved first. He kicked a split hitching block under the wheel. The wagon struck it hard enough to crack the wood, but the roll slowed. Clara jammed her boot against the brake lever and leaned until the iron linkage caught. The wagon stopped 6 feet from a watering trough. For a moment, nobody spoke. Clara bent over the brake assembly. 1 wooden block had split through the grain. The replacement pin beside it was shaved too thin and had worked loose. "Who fitted this?" The tall man looked down. "I did." "Then you fitted the pin to the hole instead of the strain." His eyes narrowed, but not with anger. "What would you have done?" "Cut a new block. Hard maple if you have it, oak if you don't." "New pin too." A man outside the mercantile laughed. "Listen to her." Clara turned. It was the same man who had refused her work 20 minutes earlier. He owned the town's wagon shop. He had looked at her calloused hands, heard that she had spent 15 years beside her father building wheels, frames, braces, and wagon boxes, then told her he did not hire women for men's work. The hotel had refused her a room after that. So had the boarding house. One door after another. Clara looked back at the brake. "Your wagon doesn't care who repairs it." The laughter stopped. The tall man crouched beside her. Up close, he looked near 40, lean rather than broad, with sun-cut lines around his eyes and a shirt patched neatly at one elbow. Elias Rourke, Clara Bennett. "You really a wheelwright?" "Yes." "Carpenter too?" "Timber work." "What kind?" "Frames, roofs, mill braces, small bridges." That made him study her more carefully. "My bridge washed out in May." Clara sat back on her heels. "What kind?" "Wagon bridge. Creek crossing. About 28 feet. "What survived?" "West approach. Some decking. East stone support." "How bad is the bank?" "Bad enough that I've been riding around the North Ford for 3 months." "With a wagon?" "Can't." She looked at his supplies. "You need the bridge before winter." "I do." "And whoever you hired failed." "I hired 2 men. 1 left. 1 wanted half his pay before setting the first beam." Was the old support sound? "I don't know." That answer mattered. He did not pretend. Elias glanced toward her bedroll. "You looking for work?" "I was." "Still are?" "What are you offering?" "A wage. Meals. Foreman's cabin is empty." "And who decides whether the bridge is safe?" He watched her. "I own the ranch." That wasn't my question. The men near the mercantile had gone quiet. Clara hated that part, the expectation that she would soften because people were listening. She did not. "If I take the work, I control measurements and structural calls. If I say we stop, until I know why something looks wrong. You can fire me after. You cannot order me to build something I believe will fail." Elias looked at the wagon, then at the brake she had just kept from rolling into the trough. "How long to inspect the bridge?" "1 hour if the banks are clear." "And after that?" "I tell you whether I can do it." He nodded. "Fair." By late afternoon, Clara was riding north beside Elias, with her bedroll tied behind a borrowed saddle. The town fell away quickly. Open grass gave way to cottonwoods and pale stone. The air cooled near the creek, and shadows stretched long beneath the trees. Rourke Crossing sat 4 miles from town. The ranch house was plain, the barn older, and the south hay shed leaned enough that Clara noticed it before the cattle. She noticed the bridge last. What remained lay crooked across the creek like a broken rib. Half the decking was gone. 1 timber bent downstream. The western approach still stood, though mud had eaten around its lower edge. The eastern stone abutment looked solid from a distance. Clara did not trust distance. She climbed down the bank, opened her worn folding rule, and measured the crack near the base. Elias stayed above her. Well? Not yet. She checked the face of the stone, then the top line. The support leaned. Not much. Enough. She set 3 alignment marks, drove a straight reference stake into firm ground, and measured again. Elias came down beside her. You think it moved? I think it may still be moving. We lose days if we rebuild that support. We lose more if we build 28 feet of bridge on a lie. He looked toward the western sky. How many days do we have? Clara folded the rule. Before freeze-up makes footing work unreliable? 24 if the weather stays kind. And if it doesn't? Less. He looked at the ruined crossing, then at her. What do you need tomorrow? 2 men, saws, augers, rope, every sound timber you have, and nobody touches that eastern support until I measure it again. Elias glanced toward the ranch. For the first time since town, Clara expected resistance. Instead, he said, "Then we wait." She looked at him. Elias walked back toward the house. Clara remained beside the creek with the folding rule in her hand and the first cold edge of evening settling over the water. 24 days. And the part of the bridge that could save them the most time might be the one thing they could not trust. At first light, Clara was already at the creek. She unfolded her rule, checked the 3 marks on the eastern abutment, and wrote the numbers on a scrap of pine with a carpenter's pencil. The stone had not moved overnight. That was good. It was not proof. Behind her, Boots came down the bank. Elias carried 2 augers over one shoulder and a coil of rope in his left hand. Men are bringing the saws. How many? 2. You trust them? With cattle? That wasn't my question. Elias set down the rope. I trust them to follow instructions if I'm standing nearby. Clara looked at him. That will do. The first days settled into hard, measured work. They stripped away damaged decking and sorted every surviving piece into 3 piles. Sound, questionable, useless. Clara rejected more timber than Elias liked. He said so once. That beam carried wagons for 12 years, and now it has rot around the bolt hole. It still feels solid. Clara handed him the auger. Drill it! He did. The bit passed through the center too easily. Dark, softened wood came out with it. Elias examined the shavings. All right? No argument. No wounded pride. He tossed the beam into the useless pile. Clara watched him do it. Men often claimed they respected knowledge, until knowledge cost them something. Elias had just thrown away 8 feet of timber he needed, because she had shown him why. That counted. By the 4th day, they had cleared the ruined span and strengthened the western approach. The eastern stone support still bothered her. Every morning, Clara measured it. Every evening, she measured again. Nothing changed. Elias began bringing the figures to her before she asked. Same as yesterday. I'll check. You think I can't read a rule? I think I'm responsible for the answer. He nodded. Fair enough. They spent the 5th afternoon shaping a replacement beam. It was heavier than Clara wanted to admit. Elias took one end. She took the other. They lifted. The weight pulled hard against her shoulder. Without speaking, Elias shifted his hands and began taking more of the load. Stop. He stopped. You're throwing the balance off. I'm helping. You're making me fight the beam. She tapped the timber with 2 fingers. Move your right hand 6 inches toward the center. He did. Now lift. They raised it again. The timber balanced between them. The strain spread evenly. Elias looked across the beam at her. Better. Yes. They carried it to the sawhorses. He never tried to take her end again. That evening, Clara sat outside the foreman's cabin, sharpening a chisel. For the first 4 nights, she had repacked every tool before dark. Saws wrapped, augers cleaned, rule folded into its leather sleeve. everything ready to leave. Elias came from the barn carrying a small hinge in one hand. He sat on an overturned bucket several feet away and began filing rust from the pin. You always pack your tools like that? Yes. Even when you're using them again at sunrise? Yes. He worked the file along the hinge. Habit, experience. He waited. She appreciated that. Clara ran the sharpening stone across the chisel. My father owned a shop outside Bozeman. Wagons? Anything wood would hold together. Wheels mostly. Freight boxes, roof frames, mill braces. You worked with him? From 15 onward. Elias turned the hinge. What happened to the shop? He died. The file stopped. Clara kept sharpening. For 3 weeks after the funeral, men who had watched me build their wheels stood inside that shop and asked when I planned to hire someone qualified. Elias said nothing, so I kept working. Then they stopped coming. Because you were a woman? Because they could convince themselves my father had been doing the difficult part. She tested the chisel edge with her thumb. He had been dead 2 months. Somehow he was still receiving credit. Elias looked toward the dark outline of the bridge. You want another shop? Clara slipped the chisel into its roll. I want my name on the work. That was all she gave him. He did not tell her she deserved it. He did not promise that people would change. He simply nodded. The next morning, the eastern mark had moved. Clara stared at the measurement. A fraction less than half an inch. Enough to matter. Elias came down behind her. What? She showed him. He crouched. Could be the stake. Could be. Rain had softened the ground 2 nights earlier. Clara pulled the reference stake and moved 20 feet uphill to harder soil. She established a second line using a straight timber and the western abutment as an independent reference. She measured twice. Now we wait. They lost another day. Elias did not complain. But Clara saw him checking the sky. 11 mornings remained before the date she had marked as dangerous. At sunrise, she measured again. The stone had shifted. Not much, but it had shifted. Elias rubbed a hand over his face. You're certain? I want one more test. Clara built it carefully. They laid a salvaged beam across the damaged support without attaching it to the bridge. Then they loaded the beam gradually with sacks of feed taken from the barn. No men stood beneath it. No animal crossed it. Clara placed a chalk line against the stone face. Another sack. Elias added one. Nothing. Another. He added it. The crack near the base widened almost too little to see. Clara lowered herself beside it. Come here. Elias crouched. She pointed. He watched the chalk line. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the stone moved. A thin shower of grit dropped from the crack. Elias stood. Unload it. They removed the sacks immediately. The support eased back only partway. Clara closed her folding rule. We can't use it. Elias stared across the creek. Nearly a week of preparation had just become worthless. What now? Clara pointed upstream. The creek narrowed between 2 firmer banks about 30 yards away. We move the crossing. How? New footings. Timber trestles. Shorter span. How much timber? She told him. Elias turned toward the ranch. He was silent long enough that Clara knew he was counting every usable beam he owned. Finally, he looked back. We don't have that much. I know. How long? 12 days if nothing else goes wrong. The first cold wind of the morning moved through the cottonwoods. Elias looked at the failed stone support, then at the untouched bank upstream. 12 days, he said. Clara shook her head. 11 after today. And the bridge they had planned to repair no longer existed anywhere except in pieces around their feet. By sunrise, Clara had already measured the new crossing twice. The upstream banks were narrower, firmer, and high enough to keep the bridge deck above ordinary spring water. It was a better location than the old one. It was also useless without timber. Elias stood beside her while she marked the first footing. How short are we? 2 long beams. Maybe 3 if I reject anything else. You planning to? If the wood deserves it. He looked toward the ranch. Clara followed his eyes. The south hay shed stood beyond the corral, old but straight, its roof carried by heavy pine beams, darkened by years of dry weather. She had noticed them on her first afternoon. Elias had too. No, Clara said. I didn't say anything. You were about to. That shed hasn't held hay in 3 years. It still has value. So does a bridge. She closed her rule. If you tear it apart, you lose winter storage. I already lost the bridge. That doesn't make the shed free. Elias looked at the creek. Then he started walking. Where are you going? To see how many beams are worth saving. Clara caught up with him. Elias. He stopped. If we use them, there is no putting that shed back before winter. I know. You'll have equipment sitting under canvas. I know. And spring repairs. He turned toward her. Clara, I understand what it costs. She waited. That's why I'm choosing it. By noon, the south hay shed had no roof. 2 ranch hands worked the rafters loose, while Elias lowered each beam with rope. Clara inspected every piece before accepting it. One had a hidden split near the end. She rejected it. Elias said nothing. The next 2 were sound. By evening, they had enough. The following 6 days passed in measured exhaustion. They dug the new footing pits deeper than the old bridge had ever used. They packed gravel by hand, set timber bases, raised trestle frames, and cut joints under lantern light when daylight failed. The ranch itself shrank around the work. Meals became quicker. Cattle rounds were divided between fewer men. A broken gate stayed broken because the bridge mattered more. Clara stopped repacking her tools at night. The first time she noticed, she had already reached the foreman's cabin. She looked back toward the work shed. Her saw remained on the bench. The augers leaned against the wall. Her rule sat where she had left it, beside a half-cut joint. For several seconds, she considered going back. She did not. The next morning, everything was still there. Elias found her fitting a brace into the eastern trestle. What do you think the barn roof will need in spring? Clara glanced up. Why? South edge sags after snow. You asking me as the bridge carpenter? I'm asking because you notice things. She drove the brace tighter. 2 rafters replaced, maybe 3. Can it wait? If you brace the center before the first heavy snow. He nodded as though adding it to a list. Clara looked back at the timber. He had asked about spring. Not next week. Not before she left. Spring. Neither of them mentioned it. 4 days remained when the center span finally began to look like a bridge. Clara walked the new structure from end to end before anyone laid decking. She checked each joint with her fingers. She sighted down the timber. She measured the west trestle, then the east, then the first upstream footing. She stopped. Elias was cutting pegs near the bank. What is it? Clara measured again. The number stayed wrong. Not badly wrong. Less than an inch. She crouched and placed her palm against the base. The footing had settled. Elias came beside her. How much? 5/8. He looked along the structure. Can we correct it at the top? Yes. Clara stayed crouched. But it puts the load slightly off center. How slightly? Enough that I'd know. He understood the answer before she gave it. What do we have to do? Take down this frame. Pull the base. Repack the gravel. Set it again. How long? Most of a day. Elias looked toward the sky. The morning had started clear. Now pale clouds were spreading from the northwest. The thermometer outside the barn had read 28 degrees before sunrise. We have 3 days after this one, he said, if the weather holds. And if we leave it? Clara looked at the footing. It might carry every load you put on it this winter. Might. Yes. He rubbed his thumb across the edge of the timber. You built it. I did. You made the mistake? Yes. Elias looked at her. Clara did not soften it. I packed the lower layer too quickly yesterday. I thought the gravel had seeded. It hadn't. Nobody else had seen it. They could have decked the bridge. They could have finished before the weather turned. Maybe nothing would happen. Maybe the bridge would stand for 20 years. Clara folded her rule. I won't cover it. Elias looked at the structure they had spent 6 days building. Then at the snow-colored sky. Take it apart. Clara stared at him. You understand what that means. Yes. We may miss the freeze. Then we miss it with a bridge we trust. The words landed harder than she expected. Elias picked up a mallet. Tell me where to start. They worked until their fingers stiffened. The frame came down. The footing came out. Clara dug beneath it herself until Elias took the shovel from her, only because she needed both hands to check depth. Nobody complained. Nobody asked whether the correction was necessary. By late afternoon, the gravel had been repacked in thinner layers. Clara tested each one before allowing the next. The base went back. The measurement held. Darkness came before the frame was upright again. Lanterns were hung from 2 posts. Elias worked beside her without speaking. Near midnight, the final brace slid into place. Clara measured once, then again. Good. Elias sat down on a timber offcut. That word sounds expensive now. She almost laughed. Almost. The following day, they built the final truss on level ground beside the creek. The old hayshed beams fitted exactly where Clara had planned. By dusk, the joints were pinned. The structure lay ready for the morning lift. Clara walked around it one last time. Nothing remained to cut. Nothing remained to correct. Only raising it. A cold flake landed on the back of her hand. She looked up. Another crossed the lantern light. Then another. Across the creek, Elias stopped coiling rope. The first snow had arrived. The finished truss lay between them and the water, and it was still on the ground. Snow gathered along the truss before dawn. Not much. Just enough to whiten the upper edges of the beams and make every rope feel colder than it had the night before. Clara stood beneath a lantern with her folding rule open against the final joint. Elias came down the bank carrying 2 coils of rope. Anything move? No? Anything you dislike? Ask me after we raise it. He gave a small nod. The ranch hands arrived behind him. Nobody spoke loudly. They had spent too many days making the pieces fit to treat the final lift like a celebration. Clara walked the truss from one end to the other. Every peg, every brace, every rope point. She checked the footing they had rebuilt 2 days earlier and pressed her boot against the packed ground. Still solid. The snow thickened slightly. All right, she said. Lines in position. Elias moved toward the nearest hauling rope. Clara looked at him. You're pulling? You need another man. I need the ranch owner listening. You'll have both. The men spread along the lines. The truss lay beside the creek, heavy enough that no one person could influence it once it started moving. Clara took her position near the upstream footing. Slow on my count. The ropes tightened. Pull. The truss lifted inches from the ground. Snow shook from the timber. Hold. Everybody froze. Clara checked the angle. Again, the men leaned back. The structure rose higher. For a few seconds, everything moved exactly as she had planned. Then the eastern end climbed faster than the west. Stop. The ropes went rigid. Elias looked toward her. What? Right line is pulling too steep. One ranch hand glanced at the truss hanging above the ground. We can muscle it over. No. Clara stepped toward the eastern rope. Lower it. The man frowned. We already have it halfway. Lower it. Elias did not look at the hanging structure. He looked at Clara. You heard her. They eased it back down. It landed with a dull wooden thud. Clara moved the eastern rope to a lower anchor point and shortened the secondary line. Elias watched. That enough? It changes the pull. And if it doesn't? We lower it again. Nobody argued. They reset. Pull. The ropes drew tight. This time, both ends rose together. The truss climbed slowly until it stood nearly upright. Hold. Clara checked the footing seats. Now ease east. The structure moved 6 inches. 2 more. It moved again. Down. The men fed rope carefully. The lower ends settled into their prepared seats. Wood met timber with a deep knock that Clara felt through the soles of her boots. She climbed onto the lower frame. Elias stood beneath her holding the peg basket. Large pin. He handed it up. She drove the first locking peg, then the second, then the west. When the 4th peg seated fully, Clara stepped down. Nobody cheered. No, not yet. Decking, she said. They worked through the morning. Snow came and went. Boards crossed the span one after another. Elias drilled. Clara fitted. The ranch hands pinned and carried. By noon, the bridge had a complete deck. It looked finished. Clara knew better. Elias wiped sawdust from his sleeve. Test? Empty wagon first. He hitched a wagon with no freight. One ranch hand started toward the seat. Elias caught the side rail. I'll do it. Clara looked at him. You don't have to prove anything. I'm not. He climbed up. I own the wagon. That is not a better argument. It's the one I have. She almost smiled. Almost. Walk the team, no speed. Elias nodded. The wagon rolled toward the bridge. Clara moved beneath the center span where she could see the joints and trestles. The front wheels reached the decking. The new timbers gave a small wooden complaint. Normal. The rear wheels followed. Clara watched the center brace. Nothing shifted. The wagon continued. Elias reached the far bank. He turned. One ranch hand grinned. Clara raised a hand. Not finished. They loaded sacks of feed. Then more. Enough to approximate the weight of a winter supply run. Elias climbed up again. Clara checked the bridge one last time. Go. The loaded wagon rolled onto the span. This time the wood settled deeper. Clara crouched beside the trestle. The footing held. The repaired frame held. The main joint tightened exactly where it should. Halfway across, Elias looked toward her. Clara did not look back. She watched the bridge. The wagon reached the far side. Then Elias turned it and crossed again. When the rear wheels rolled off the decking, Clara stood. It holds. For the first time that morning, the men made noise. Elias drove the wagon back beside her and climbed down. Snow had melted along the shoulders of his coat. You sound surprised. I sound accurate. 24 days? 23. You're counting the first afternoon. I always count the first afternoon. He looked at the bridge. So what happens now? Now you use it. He reached into his coat and handed her a folded pay envelope. Clara stared at it. You carried that through the test? I thought you might leave immediately afterward. She opened it. Every dollar they had agreed upon was there. No deduction for lost time. No deduction for rejected timber. No deduction for rebuilding the footing she had set wrong. Clara folded the envelope. You paid the contract. I said I would. Only then did Elias speak again. I have a barn roof that needs work in spring. Clara said nothing. 3 wagons needing repair before roundup. Still nothing. Fence braces, corral gates, and this bridge will need watching once the runoff starts. She looked at him. What are you asking? Elias rested one hand against the new railing. I'm asking whether you want work that doesn't end today. Work. Yes. Only work? He looked toward the creek. When he answered, his voice was quieter. No. Clara waited. I'm asking whether you want to build something here with your own name on it. The ranch hands had already moved away. No audience. No pressure. Clara looked at the bridge they had raised together. Then at Elias. If I stay, I will argue about measurements. I know. I will stop work if something looks wrong. I know. I may tell you your barn roof is worse than you think. I already assume that. She smiled then. Small, but real. You might regret this. Elias looked at the bridge. I learned better than to argue before you measure twice. Weeks later, winter lay hard across Rourke Crossing. The bridge carried flour, salt, hay, tools, and everything else the ranch needed. One evening, Clara and Elias worked beneath the upstream end, fitting a replaceable wear block, where spring water would strike hardest. Elias held the lantern. Clara opened her father's folding rule. 14 3/4. He waited. She measured again. Still 14 3/4. Now I can speak? Now you can cut. He handed her the saw instead. Clara made the cut herself. Later, inside the workshed, she folded the worn rule and placed it on a new bench Elias had built. Burned into the front edge were the words, C. Bennett and E. Rourke. Rourke Crossing. If you enjoyed watching Clara and Elias build something worth staying for, subscribe and leave a like for more Wild West stories.